Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Made Possible by Pop Culture, the podcast. I'm your host and producer, Danielle Turchiano. And once again, if you're new here, this is the podcast where I ask my guests to come on and share stories from their childhood about the pop culture that shaped them then. And then we talk about what's influencing them from that world today. So today I have a very special guest I'm excited to introduce you to, although you probably already know him. It's Ben Travers. He's the deputy editor and TV critic at IndieWire, which I can't believe this is true, but he just celebrated his 10th anniversary there, which huge feat in journalism. So congrats to him. Also, before that, he worked for Pop Matters and he did some time in production, just like me. So I'm very excited to talk about all things. So Ben, first and foremost, how are you? How are things today? What's going on in your world?
Oh, I'm just watching far too much television. That was an incredible
Shocking.
introduction for what my job essentially boils down to, which is watching way more TV that is healthy for anyone to consume. So I'm hoping that at least a little bit of that time can be helpful to your listeners, and we'll see how it goes. But yeah, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm also excited because we talked before you came on to kind of figure out what you wanted to talk about. And it is something that I was very influenced by. So I came prepared. I don't know if you could really,
Oh,
if you're
beautiful. Oh
watching at
my
home
gosh.
via the YouTube, I'm wearing a shirt, but let's have Ben. Ben, you set it up. You set up what you picked. Give me a little background on what what pop culture piece in childhood influenced you the most.
So this is always very difficult for me because I have at least what I consider a particularly bad memory. So when I'm asked to think back over any amount of time whatsoever, whether it's like, a wide range of years or a very specific time period, it's often difficult for me to like place myself in that time.
Yeah, same.
Um, but the question you asked was helpful because I really feel like a lot of who I am was shaped by how much I loved and how much I watched Friends, the NBC sitcom that I
Mhm.
feel like everyone in the world literally is familiar with.
We
But
can set it up if you feel like you need, do you want it? It's about six friends who live in New York. They're in their 20s
six,
through their 30s. I know, I do feel like everyone is familiar with it, but you had a very specific piece of it that
yeah,
influenced you. It wasn't just the show as a whole.
I glommed onto Chandler Bing very quickly. And among the six friends, especially as I've gotten older, I've kind of shifted in terms of like who I pay attention to and who resonates with me as, time progresses and as like I get older, or I just am desperate to find new things to think about as I watch this for the 100th time because I just can't stop. But Chandler was definitely the one who, when, I was a teenager a little before when I first started watching it, and was obviously trying to figure out how to be an adult or what an adult looked like. And, I grew up in um, rural Illinois, outside of a village, like a literal village of 1,000 people on a farm. And the idea of living in New York, which you always see on TV, was, incredibly glamorous and insane. And like that would never happen. And the fact that I'm here now living in New York is still pretty hard to wrap my head around, especially when trying to go back to that age.
Hmm.
But Chandler was somebody who I think was just very identifiable, like purposefully so, written that way, acted that way. He's very funny. He uses humor as a defense mechanism. He's very rarely proud of himself, so that ethos fit my Midwestern mentality very well. And then he was always kind of trying to figure out what his future was going to be. So I feel like as a young person, you would, attach yourself to that mentality a little more than some people who seem to have it figured out. And sure, like Rachel was also very much trying to figure out, where she was going to go and who she was going to be. But at the time, Chandler was the funny one, so I just kind
Yeah.
of latched on.
It's interesting to hear you say that too, because I do feel, especially in the guests that are coming on this podcast in these first few episodes, a lot of people that I'm having on have been talking about how their love of these shows or these pieces in pop culture shaped what they wanted to do professionally. So to hear you say, well, the fact that Chandler didn't know, did that help lead you to like, maybe I should do what Chandler's doing, or should I try to write a show like where I could write a character about Chandler? Like, did it do anything for you to help you figure out who you wanted to be professionally?
I think it's applicable more now than it was then in a weird way, because anyone who's in media feels like the ground is sinking beneath their feet pretty much at all
Yes.
times. So like again, I in your very kind introduction, I'm very lucky to have been at one place for 10 years and to kind of built a little bit
Oh, I
of
also
a
meant
job for
it's,
myself.
I can't believe you look so young. I can't believe you've been in this for 10 years, let alone at one place. So, which means that wasn't your first job. So that's what I
I
meant. But also,
I've just
yes.
been I've just been moisturizing every day for like 15 years. That's really all that's happening here. I'm very, very old. And want to be an old man desperately. Every time I get a gray, it's an exciting day. But yeah, no, I feel like back then I always knew that in some way I loved movies and I loved TV. Like it was obviously a very common hobby or a thing to be invested in as a kid. But my dad, my mom, and my dad were particularly good about encouraging anything that sparked our interest. Like they didn't try to put limitations on like anything me and my sister would want to go after or pursue. And they also just, I mean, we lived 45 minutes away from the nearest movie theater, and they would
Mm,
still make weekly or near weekly trips to that theater so that, we could kind of be in awe of all these people on the big screen. And back then, I mean, Friends was on once a week, usually 8 months of the year. So whenever it came on, it was a big event. Like when you asked me about kind of formative experiences, I remember very distinctly being at like a Thanksgiving and trying to get home in time from our like group family Thanksgiving to watch Friends. And it was like my sister and my mom were
mm,
completely on board with this goal. And when I realized that all three of us were kind of like, oh, we're united, we have to do this, it felt, very meaningful and made the show feel even bigger than it was. And there's so many of those kind of stories that are tied into it. But no, I feel like Chandler's kind of search for what he was meant to do,
mm,
um, and who he was meant to be. When I was younger, it was much more about the romantic search, and now that I'm older, it's much more about the professional search. And that, like, I love what I do now, but I always feel like I have to be ready for that pivot, ready for that moment, like when Chandler left his very obscure job, sitting at a desk to figure out
right.
what he wanted to do, and ended up in marketing. Um, I feel like, that's very much the path for a lot of writers these days, and
Yeah.
it's great if it is, but if you should also try to take the time to think about, what you really want, if the first option isn't available. So yeah, but yeah, when I was younger, Chandler being completely lost when it
Mm.
came to women was incredibly identifiable. So
Well, I mean, listen, he was lost for very, very many years slash seasons, but he did eventually fall in love with Monica. They did get married. It did that he arguably had the more stable of any of their relationships when you look back on the show and you look at the time that the characters were trying to find the one they were supposed to be with. Was there a particular arc of his within those 10 seasons, or even maybe a specific episode where you really pinpointed that's what I'm struggling with now, and that's what attracted you, or attracted is maybe the wrong word, but like that's what really connected you to him specifically?
um there's that again. I feel like it was more the broad trajectory of Chandler with women than it was the specific people he dated or ended up with. Like I love that he ended up with Monica, and I was, especially young when I was younger, kind of obsessed with the idea that, whoever you marry, whoever you want to be with for the rest of your life should be your best friend, like should be
Mm-hmm.
somebody you consider like, that important to you, and that you get along with outside of, any of the romantic aspects or traditionally romantic aspects of dating. Um, but also seeing him kind of go through the search and date different
Yeah.
people and kind of convince himself that this person worked for him, even when it was clear to the audience and clear to his friends that, maybe they don't. Maybe Janice isn't the one. Like maybe you should, keep looking a little bit. That fear of looking once you found something that might
Mm.
work was always very resonant. And then also, I think the idea of the approval of your friends became very important to me because I was also very lucky. I have friends who I've known like one literally my entire life. Like
Mm.
our parents were friends, and from the moment I was born, we were hanging out. Um, and then others that I've kind of gathered along the years who are very important and who, if they had a problem with the person I was dating, it would be an issue. So it became that same kind of friends
Mm.
test where, like, if they don't, like, in the TV show, it's basically like usually those are one-off side plots where they date somebody and like that kind of carries an arc so that other things can happen and they can balance the show, and that's how it's written. But, as you're watching it, you're not thinking of it that way. You're kind of thinking like, well, once this person becomes part of the group, like once they're
Yeah.
ushered in with the sick, like that's a significant step. And that means they're serious and that, things could happen. So like him ending up with Monica, like falling for Monica and keeping it a secret for a while. And it's comic gold and it's a great way to kind of build up that relationship. But it also, upped the stakes from the get-go. Like it made
Oh
it
yeah.
a serious endeavor for the audience as soon as it happened. So that was something that was always kind of stuck in my mind too, where it's like if you date a friend, like that's a big deal. Like
Did it stop
that's gonna be a
you?
problem.
Do you feel
No,
like it
absolutely
stopped?
not.
Okay.
No. And I'm sure
Because
my friends would yell at me for dating a few people and who I'm no longer dating.
right.
And being like, you ruined that part of our group. Like they were great. I'm like, sorry. So
I mean, listen, there are lessons to be taken from TV shows, but I'm not also trying to insinuate that you should live your life solely learning from TV shows. So it's not, I mean, I think maybe it's better that you had that experience, that you weren't just like, I'm going to do what Chandler did and only what Chandler did. You know what I mean? I think that there's a narrow view that sometimes people take.
yeah, and it's very easy to fall into those views when you're younger, and just like kind of anything with life, if it's all you're exposed to, then that's kind of the trajectory you're gonna put yourself on because that's all you think you know or all you do know. Um, but I guess part of what I appreciated about Chandler's arc and about Friends as a whole, in part because it ran for so long, was that they did introduce you to so many different kinds of relationships and so many different people that you could date and so many different ways that that relationship could go. Like I often consider myself a hopeless romantic, and the Ross and Rachel storyline of Friends, where it was on again, off again for so many years and so
Right.
long, it's a blessing and a curse. It's like that little hope that you have when, you break up with somebody and you're like, oh, did I screw this up? Is she really the one? Should I like hold that in my heart and come back to it? It's like that can be good. Like it can be good to kind of keep
Sometimes.
that, but it can also be really
I was going to
toxic
say,
and
but
bad.
sometimes maybe there's a reason you broke up.
Exactly. Yeah. And understanding that, is something that usually gets breezed by in a sitcom. It's like, well, this is just what happened and we're done with it and we're moving on. And in life, it's like you have to kind of acknowledge, okay, how significant is that? What is the big ticket item? But
I just
um
think it's funny that you just called yourself a hopeless romantic when you started the conversation being like, I identify with Chandler, because Chandler is not. And you also mentioned earlier, just in terms of you called it because of your Midwestern background, but just how he's hard on himself and he's not always proud of himself. I never, I'll be honest, I never saw it that way with him, that it was that he wasn't proud of himself. I always thought of like he's just a cynical person. And it's like he's not internalizing some of this. It's more of just this is how he uses humor as a defense mechanism. We know that this is just how he responds to life. So hearing you say he's not proud of himself now makes me kind of, in my head, I'm playing back certain moments like, oh, that's a different perspective. I'm wondering if there's one moment maybe that became clear for you, or that was maybe a more poignant, that interpretation made that moment more poignant for you, and maybe even changed the way that you started to look at yourself and how hard you were on yourself.
I think honestly it's probably the episode when Mr. Heckles dies and they
Mm.
go up to his apartment, and Chandler kind of gets obsessed with his stuff, and he starts comparing himself to Mr. Heckles, and obviously not very favorably. And it's been a bit now since I've seen that episode, but what struck me about it was how hard Chandler was on himself, and how like Joey and his friends had to kind of remind him like this isn't necessarily who you are, who you're becoming. And he didn't necessarily react that well to what he analyzed in the episode, um, or self-analyzed in that episode.
Right.
But for the show to do that early, because that's season
It's
two,
very early.
season one, like it's
Ooh, this is where I admit that they all begin to blur because now I watch them in binges. And
yeah.
so
I can see it in my head, and like the image of Chandler is
yeah, and
very
they were
like
young. It was, I mean,
very
it was
early.
definitely, it was either season one or season two. I'll say that off the top of my
Yeah.
head. Off the top of my head, I want to say season two.
Yeah, it's right on that cusp, and I think it is too. But anyway, I was very struck by them doing that with a character who, again, like has been the comic relief, has been kind of the friend. He's got the steady job and makes, enough money to kind of support him and Joey for,
Right.
for so long, but he's never happy with his job. Like he's not proud of it. He doesn't really hang
Mhm.
out with people from work. He always comes, to the coffee shop to see his friends and do whatever they do. But then it's also like the people he considers himself like worthy of dating, and like the people he can date versus the people that Joey can date.
Right.
It was all this stuff where in his head it just seemed like Chandler was somebody who was ready to knock himself down like a few pegs, or at least take that idea of being cynical
Hmm.
and applying it to his own fate, or his own just lot in life, I guess. Even though, from 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 our current adult point of view, if he's, living in New York and can afford that apartment and have that lifestyle and do all these things, and he's doing pretty well. But
Well, I mean, listen, it depends on how you define success because I think you hit it on the head a couple times. And he did not like his job, but he stayed in it for so long. Even when he would tell Rachel, like, you need the fear, you need to go after what you want to do, he didn't because he had too much fear.
too
So,
much fear.
I mean,
I'm
it's
too
just,
afraid.
I get that. I get why we're so outwardly as a society looking at the lifestyle and like the apartment. And yes, he could afford all these things. I also think it is worth definitely pointing out he paid for his lifestyle and Joey's, which is he was successful in a monetary way. I'm not denying that. But I do think the fact that he was in a job he hated for so long is a terrible way to live. And I also think it's a terrible thing to like if you're saying I identify with Chandler, it's a terrible it's role model to have. Did
Yeah, I
you
think it
did
I
you
think
look
it
at that? Did you look at that and say, like, okay, I love him. I identify, but I can never be that. I can never take a job and be in a job that I hate for that long.
yeah, I think
Okay,
that
I
was
feel better
kind
about you
of I
now.
think
Okay.
that was kind of like how I embodied Chandler, or like tried to embody Chandler, where it was like, okay, so he's clearly got a job where he's making money. And like, I don't think I was literally thinking these thoughts when I
Mm,
was younger, but I
sure.
think they kind of seeped their way into my subconscious. It's like he's got this job where he's making plenty of money, and he's got his friends, but he still seems unhappy. Like he's
Mm,
happy with his friends, but he's unhappy, and the fact that he doesn't have his person. He hasn't found the person he wants to be with, and he doesn't seem to have found, or even really is searching that hard for the fulfilling part of his career, like something that's going to bring him joy, based on the accomplishments that he has through that. So it's like I'm going to prioritize those things. I'm
mhm.
not going to prioritize the money. Obviously, I'm a TV critic and a journalist. Like that was never something anyone does to make a ton of money.
But you would not
um
know that because the way that TV has portrayed journalism in the past, Carrie Bradshaw is making $4 a word and buying tens of thousands of dollars of shoes every year. So,
that was a real shot in the arm when I finally watched Sex and the City in college. It was like, oh, you know what? Maybe I'm on the right track. Maybe this was a good choice to go into journalism. Seems like she's going to do fine. Get a whole big shoe collection, and still have money to spend on lunches and dinners. But yeah, I do feel like that plays into the hopeless romantic part of me, where it's like he really prioritized finding that person. Like he wasn't good at it. He didn't think he could really ever hope to dream of somebody like
Hmm.
Monica being the person that he ended up with. Um, but it did seem like the big missing part for Chandler. And again, like this is, to put it into better context, like this is Friends. This is a 90s sitcom. Like so
Yeah.
much of it was based in romantic comedy style aspirations. It's a Cheers successor where there's the Sam and Diane, but there's also all these other, hopeful relationships going on, and dating is such a huge priority. Um, and yeah, for me, again, when I was younger, it's not, I'm not thinking about any of that. I'm just thinking about like, I think to be happy, you should really find your person, and then you'll get there. Like then the rest of it you can figure out. But like the person is the difficult thing. Like the,
Mm.
the relationships are the difficult thing, and those are what you have to prioritize, which is part of why I still defend Friends to the death. Like whenever I uh, have the recurring argument with my wife, who
Okay.
loves Seinfeld more than
Okay.
anything in the world. Whenever I'm like, you know what, I think Friends is better, she will just pounce on me, but I'll stick with it because I think that the emotion of Friends and
Mm.
the sentiment of Friends is its strength, and it can't be beat. Like you can, plenty of critics have rightly harped on the fact that they had an astounding cast, and they
Mm.
had joke writers who were really cranking them out at the top of their game for years on end. And we were also the beneficiaries of a time when, a sitcom like this could run for 22 episodes,
Right.
24 episodes a season, which is what they really need to flourish and to sink in as much as they do with audiences. Um, but I just feel like as much of that is nostalgia on my end for something that I grew attached to at a formative age, I also feel like that's something the show earned again and again and
Mm.
again with the audience, which is prioritizing the relationships and the sentimentality and friendship and romance and all of the things that
Yeah.
really make life great. So,
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't
yeah.
just so many sitcoms that came before it was the of the week and not much advanced week to week. This, I think, from in my memory, was probably one of the first ones I watched because I was young when it was on, where that week to week really did matter in a different way. But I'm gonna admit, I'm a little stuck on something you just said about the well, it's twofold. So you mentioned, the find your person and like then everything else will fall into place aspect. And I think that's a really interesting perspective, but I also think it's very interesting to hear it from you, a man, saying that, because I do think that there are so many pieces of media that are actively telling women that we've rallied against it and saying like that's not all there is to life is romantic love. And so to hear you say like that it wasn't actively saying that to you, but that's what you took away from it anyway, I think is really special. And I'm curious if you feel like that was because of your age and where you were, or if it was because of just who you are in general. Like if you watched it today for the first time, do you feel like you'd maybe still take away the same message?
It's such a hard question
I know.
because it is you're asking about something that was formative. Like it is like this was something that
Yeah.
really, in one way or another, had an effect on how I, present myself to the world and how I think about things, especially when it comes through television. But it's an excellent point to be made about how, women have been told or forced or both for so long to think like, listen, your highest priority should be finding a husband, finding a partner, finding someone, and then you will worry about the rest later. And that was never something that was put upon men. Like we were, tasked to be the providers and all that nonsense. So I think it is unique to see that from Friends in a
Mm.
way that isn't like that doesn't come across as like cliched or patronizing
Yeah.
or dated in a gross way. But I think that's the tricky part of the question because I think anybody who feels like that, if you've identified the thing that's most important to you in life, if you know like what you really need to be happy, and that can change, obviously, it can always change. But like if you have identified it in the moment over a longer period of time, then to ask like how you'd react to something if that weren't there, if that weren't your
Mm,
like kind of cornerstone, is so difficult to
yeah,
assess. And I do think that if I was watching Friends today as a critic first, then it would be obviously very hard to get over the fact that they're all white characters living in New York
sure.
City, and that like this is all like very big and luxurious, and even, you know, the fact that it's a multicam sitcom and recorded in front of an audience, like that could be a hurdle to get over, and for a lot of people. Um, but I do think that I would probably respond the same way to Chandler's arc. It just might be more of a reversal. It might just be more of like a first I notice like the career stuff and
Mm,
gleam onto that, and then later I come back to like, oh, you know, his romantic life is really interesting, and how he pursued that is really interesting. But
yeah.
I don't know. That's the beauty of these shows, Danielle. Like as you know, like you can go back to this thing and find different ideas within them that you kind of latch onto all of a sudden, and it becomes a whole talking point and a whole thing to look back on and say like, did this affect me? Was this a thing that
Right.
I thought about then?
But also,
So
I think part of why I asked is because sometimes it is I am watching something in a formative time and learning something about myself. And
mm,
sometimes it is I already know this about myself, and now I'm watching something that is reflecting my own
mm.
thought, belief, value, whatever back to me. And so I think maybe it is a little bit of a who came first situation, but I think that is also a big part of why these things influence us the way that they do, and whether the answer is I saw myself in it and realized something about myself, or I knew it and saw myself and felt validated. I think both are very valid. And that's kind of why I like to have these conversations, because it's so different depending on who you talk to. Like, I never would call myself a hopeless romantic. I loved the Chandler Monica relationship way more than the Ross Rachel relationship. I never wanted Ross and Rachel to get together at the end. I was very upset. I'm going to get yelled at on the internet again, but even having said that, it was I knew going in at that point, that was deep into seasons of Friends when Chandler and Monica got together, and like I already knew I'm a cynical person, so like I'm more like Chandler in the cynicism, but I could be happy for this relationship because it is what I imagine a great relationship to be. I didn't see a lot
Yeah.
of them in my own life, but I was seeing it on TV, feeling like, okay, do I feel like I need my person? No, but I like seeing their journey because it obviously what you were talking about is very true. It was important to him, and it was set up from the beginning that it was important to him, and it was nice. I don't think I either cognizantly at that age was like, oh, it's nice to see it from a man and not from a woman. But certainly looking back on it, having rewatched it thousands of times, I was like, it's a nice way to tell that story.
It's also very pure for the way that they presented it. Like, you know, Monica and Chandler had been friends for so long. It wasn't like they were hinting at them becoming a couple for 3 seasons and then they finally did it. They
You
laid some
say that,
groundwork.
but there were
They'd
things
laid,
in there that,
they'd
whether
done
intentional or not, yes.
I think that was almost more of a necessity to try to ensure that if they went that way, they could,
Mm,
but they didn't have to. It
sure.
didn't feel like an inevitable thing when it happened so much as it felt like a curious new possibility. And the way that, you know, both of the characters reacted, you know, at the time also made it feel a lot more safe and welcoming, where it's like, you know, they were kind of on the same page about like, let's just end this, like let's not get too crazy with it, and then they couldn't not pursue it, and then they kept it secret, and then the secret came out, and like all these steady kind of, you know, developments that increased the serious nature was it felt very authentic in a way that I feel like a lot of today's romantic comedies and
Yeah.
sitcom romances just struggle to replicate,
Yeah. I mean, I think
because
it
the
is
audience is
harder.
almost too smart for it.
That's what I was going to say. I think it is harder now because we have all of these examples that have come before, good and bad. And we're comparing and we're saying, well, we can't do what they did because then they'll say we're copying them, or we're maybe not that good of a writer, so we can't do it for other reasons. Or, there's a million. I just gave two. Maybe there's only two reasons. I don't know.
No,
Uh,
there's plenty, but it's also worth noting that like it's interesting to see people try to challenge these expectations too, because like you were talking about how we're either looking for something on screen that reflects something that we believe so that we can kind of, like latch onto that and have an emotional response to that because, we either recognize it or, hope to recognize it or see something inspirational about it. But there's also the arcs that now, you know, they want to challenge those things. They want to say like, listen, just because these two people appeared in the show together doesn't mean they're going to end up together. Like doesn't mean like I mean Seinfeld did that with Jerry and Elaine quite well, I thought, over the years. But
Mhm.
there's so many more aggressive ways to do that these days. And I think it's interesting to watch audiences respond
Yeah.
because sometimes they're eager for that challenge. Sometimes they're eager to be like, okay, hold on. What I thought I knew and what I thought I wanted may not be what I know or wanted.
Mm.
And you're going to convince me of this in one way or another. And sometimes they just react horribly. They just get so pissed because they feel like, they were betrayed. They feel like however the show, whatever agreement the show embarked upon at the start is being violated because they've already put it in a box because it's
Mhm.
this genre or it's this setup or it's this, actor even. Um, so yeah, it is definitely a trickier thing to do these days. And I feel like probably watching New Girl play out in real time as I was older
Okay.
may be more reflective of how I'd watch Friends now because I was very critical of New Girl. There were things that I loved about it and I kept up with it the whole time, but
Mhm.
I also would get really annoyed by some of the like little romantic developments that they'd make or the choices the
Right.
characters would make or how they presented X, Y, and Z. And I'd be like, this doesn't work. You went down the wrong path. This annoys me. This is a problem. Like it
That's
became a
interesting
thing.
because when I was like, what is the other thing that's influencing you more modern times? You did not mention New Girl. So I'm
Well, is New
amused by
Girl
how this just
modern?
came up
It's been
organically.
over. It's been over for so long now, it feels like. And I don't know if I would say it influences me so much as it's a nice parallel for Friends in a way, like for that continued, we're going to try to do this. We're going to try to do the buddy comedy, but there's
Mm.
also going to be a central romance. There's going to be two actually, and uh I loved Schmidt's romance much more than I loved Nick and Jess. So like again, me just copying myself or mirroring myself, if you will. Um but yeah, I definitely like just because you asked about like how Friends might hit differently,
Sure.
like I think that's probably, if I'm being completely honest, how I might react to it. So
Okay. So then let's talk about what is influencing you today, not New Girl. Is it in the vein of Friends? Do you feel like even though it's been so many years, not to make you sound old, because again, I don't think you're old.
very
Um,
old,
is it
ready
is
to be
it still
old.
that type of programming that you gravitate towards?
Yes and no. I feel like when I was in my 20s, I think I did the kind of classic white male, like cinephile thing of falling head over heels for these like ultra serious big picture dramas.
Hmm.
And, I absolutely adored Mad Men and I love The Leftovers. Everybody who
Everybody
knows me
knows.
knows this far too well. And I still do. I still absolutely like cherish those. Um, but the longer have seen those, and this could be just a sign of the times where we've gotten so many attempts to do the big grand drama of our times. Um, I keep coming back to Bob's Burgers. I keep coming back to it is a sitcom. It's a family sitcom instead of like a friends sitcom, but they are still hanging out. It's the same core group of people. They have like an expansive world that is like, so rich in both like the color palette and the animation and also the characters who are introduced like week in and week out and recurring and guests and all that. Um, but it's just something that has stuck in my head and I think I've been thinking about it more recently because when I first started at IndieWire as a full-time employee, the first thing they did was like I showed up and I logged on and they were trying to just get me up to speed with everything, with WordPress and how the site ran. And they just kind of asked me like, what have you been watching? Like
Hmm.
what's striking to you? And I was like, well, actually the new season of Bob's Burgers was really good. And I wrote like this silly little thing about like five things about Bob's Burgers that were great. And it was like the first
Oh,
real quote unquote
cool.
article that I ran on the site. And over the years, I always come back to it. Like it's always something like obviously they're still making episodes. So the new episodes pop up and then it's like, okay, well, I want to watch that. I'm going to keep watching that. Sometimes the new episodes will hook you back into a rewatch where I'll just sit there and kind of go through a bunch of them again. Um, but it's also so interesting to watch them reinvent themselves,
Mm,
both like when they did the movie, which I thought was so fascinating and so like well done for what a challenge it was to do. Um, but also it's just so comforting. Like as they're not trying to change things on such a fundamental nature that you forget why you love the show to begin
right.
with. And yet they're still able to come up with all these new stories and like dynamics with their characters that I just find endlessly reassuring. So I think to answer your question in short, yes, it is still like Friends in that it is very comforting and it is a sitcom. And it's also not quite like Friends because they're both like adult issues going
Mhm.
on in the show and very, very childlike issues,
Right.
as opposed to like the middle ground where Friends was kind of, coming of age, figuring it out, 20 something New Yorkers just doing their thing. So,
What I find so fascinating is, and to put it into the context that you already gave, just to remind everybody, this was one of your first articles at IndieWire, which was 10 years ago, and it was not its first season. This show has been on since 2011. So to be able to say that in that run of time, it's 2024 now, that this thing that arguably is a geriatric TV show, and I'm not saying that in a bad way. I'm just saying that in a most shows today don't get nearly that many seasons way, that it's still such an influence over you, I think says so much about what it is. I think it also says a lot, though, maybe about what you're looking for out of TV. And so I'm curious if what you're looking for out of TV that leads you to this show is something that I don't have to write about week to week sometimes. Sometimes it's an escape from the things that I do have to write about week to week. Especially as you mentioned, rewatching, which I can't imagine rewatching all these episodes on top of all of the things you have to watch to write about for work.
well, this circles back to like possibly the most difficult aspect of my like work life balance, which is I often use TV and movies to relax at the end of the
Mm,
day. So like if it is something that feels safe, as in not work, then perhaps that is why I'm gravitating toward it. I honestly don't have a good answer for that, but I would say that I think Bob's Burgers exemplifies a lot of what I want TV to be and what I want TV to go back to being, which is it is a it is a relationship driven medium. You live with these characters for so long. You are meant like the greatest asset that TV has is time. It's not constricted to however long you're sitting in the theater that one time, that one evening. It is night after night, hour after hour, week after week, year after year. Like you can live with these people. And if the show can have an engine, like if it can create a story engine that sustains that, then the possibilities for what they can do with it are so exciting. And that is something that we don't see that often anymore because they're so focused on, the business side of things or just creating new shows because they think new is what really attracts people. Um, and also the broadcast model is broken, so then the longevity isn't there anymore. And it's weird to me to watch something like Bob's Burgers, where, like you said, it's been on for over 10 years, coming up on 15 years.
yeah.
And yet I also still gravitate toward It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which is, now the home
Also,
of
yeah,
live
I've been
action
on forever.
sitcom. And I just respect how committed they are to bringing in new talent, like behind the scenes, to
Mm,
help generate new stories, but also to see like, okay, this is the model that could work for these other shows that are just starting out. Like, is this what the Great North is aspiring to become? Like, very
mm.
much a Bob's Burgers spinoff type show, and I keep up with that as well, and I find it very good and rewarding. Um, but also it's like I don't know how long this can last. Every time it's up for renewal, I'm like, I don't know if this is gonna stick it out,
Mm.
but I do feel like it has that same engine. It's just not quite hitting the gears as quickly as Bob's Burgers did. So,
Well, that's what I'm
um,
hearing though, is, the relationship driven, the character driven, that's TV's bread and butter. It's not TV's problem that they can't do it. It's the network's problem because they keep canceling things before they can really hook people in that, or really even sometimes where the show can even show what it can do with these relationships. I don't think if you put either one of these shows, Friends or Bob's Burgers, on new today, I don't think it would last the way that it was able to last, even though they're both great production value, writing, acting, like everything is a well done. I hate to say machine because that,
yeah.
I think, cheapens it a little bit, but they're a well done art, craft, machine, whatever word you want to use. But it's just a different landscape now, and people are
Yeah.
looking for, I don't even know what people are looking for. I used to write about shows where I was like, I think this is going to be such a hit. I love it. And then crickets. Maybe people
Well,
were
that's
watching it,
the
not reading what I was writing, or maybe they weren't watching it at all, or maybe they were finding it 3 years later when it was on Netflix. But
yeah, exactly.
it had already been canceled off of its first run network because nobody watched it there. So,
And it's too late to restart it because everybody's moved on and the contracts are null and void, and there's no way to prove that the interest is viable enough to sustain however many new seasons they would need to make it worth restarting again. Absolutely. And this is the crux of what plagues, people who love TV these days. It's that eternal question of like, we don't really know why something didn't work. Like it could be that we were told it didn't work by the network and they canceled it. And it's like, okay, but it seemed like it was working. Like we have these figures that say this many people were watching, and we have these showrunners and creatives saying we had so much more story to tell. But I do think that there was a time where it seemed like the options were open, where TV could accommodate for a very brief window whatever type of show it wanted to be, where it's like, listen, this adaptation of this book, it's too, you know, it's too much of a labyrinth. It's too complicated. There's too
yeah.
many details for it to exist as a movie. We need 6 hours, we need 8 hours, but that's it. We don't need more than that. We just need the 8 hours. And they were like, okay, here you go. And then there was, the sitcoms that came along where they're like, we can do this for as long as you want us to do this. We're going to be your steady player. We're going to build up that library. We're going to reach syndication, which, isn't a thing anymore. And they could do that too. There were people who wanted to buy those shows. And now it just seems like because of, kind of how streaming and that mentality has affected the way that we think about TV and our relationship to TV, um, I don't think anyone really knows what people want. And the the argument that I am making with like very little authority is to go backwards. And
Mm.
that's not always the right answer. Like I do want more shows that last longer, and I do want TV to be able to embrace that, but I also don't want to give up, those great limited series or those great 4 season dramas or those great like Succession ended exactly when it was supposed to. Like that stuff should be able to exist.
Mhm.
I just wish, I guess, there were more openings for something like Bob's Burgers
Yeah.
uh, to do its thing.
I mean, I think that just goes back to the relationships between the creatives and the executives, which we know those relationships are in the toilet for most people right now because of everything that's happening with even, these big conglomerate streamers have no money. So, or their definition of no money, which is very different from my definition of no money, but whatever. I don't know. I can't imagine a world where we wouldn't have the choice that we have now in terms of, we do have some sitcoms, we do have some animated comedies, we do have some limited, like all of the options are there. My issue is when you have a show that is, as you mentioned, like Succession ended right when it should have, because they had a showrunner with a clear vision. They had a network that said, we are going to support that. We're not going to make you drag it on, even though it is our #1 show and our Emmy winning show. And also you need the relationship on the flip side. If you have someone who, you have a show they've committed to maybe second season and it's a bigger show with, cliffhanger type stuff, you need the commitment of, I'm not just going to cancel it and ruin everybody who's invested. I'm going to give you at least a few more episodes to wrap it up as best as you can, rather than they're just, that's always been my biggest gripe, is there are so many shows where, as a fan, like forget my job for a second, like as a fan of television, there were moments where I was like, I don't want to get invested in that show because I think they're going to snatch it
Yeah.
away before I get the payoff. And we see that happen so many times. And it's just like, I feel like I wasted my time getting invested in something, loving something. And then the show didn't break my heart. The network did because they didn't let the show end the way that it should have ended. They ended. They just said, we're done with it now. No resolution.
And while completely justified, that mentality is also affecting, the shows that we do see now and want
Mm-hmm.
to have long lives. And the people are just sitting, a lot of people are just sitting there going, okay, I would if I knew it was going to get an ending, or if I knew it was going to get to do what it wanted
Exactly.
to do, or if I knew that I could trust X, Y, and Z to keep it instead of like, oh no, it was on this streamer and now they canceled it, but it's on this other streamer, so I have to pay for two subscriptions. Like, how do I find it? This is too much work. I'm going to watch whatever's in front of me. And I feel like it's it is weird, again, looking back at when I was a kid watching TV
Ah,
to now to think about like the market forces that are affecting what happens with these shows. Like that, David Zaslav is over there at Warner Brothers Discovery right now, like spending a ton of money in the hopes that he can sell the network, like that he can sell this thing, because he has all these things in the offing that are
mm,
attractive for buyers, but he knows he'd never have to pay for because it's not going to be his responsibility. Right after he just spent a year, canceling and gutting and taking things off the subscription service that was supposed to be their golden goose. It's just I can't even believe I know this stuff, and I don't even know it that well, as you can tell by my very rudimentary explanation.
no, I think that was a great
Um,
explanation. I think, especially for people who don't have to do the business reporting day to day, like they need that top line, what's happening. And that was what that was. I
and
don't
it
think that
it,
was a
cre- it
bad
just
explanation at
creates a
all. It's
a
just upsetting.
distrust. Yeah, it creates these horrible vibes for something that's supposed to be, a pure relationship.
Yeah.
Like, you're always watching TV and it's always scripted, written characters, unless it's reality or documentary or whatever. But like with what we're talking about, it's
Yeah.
scripted, written characters that are fabricated and created out of somebody's imagination. But they feel real. And like to bring this full circle, so many people who love Friends talk about Friends, or at least had a period of their life when they were truly peak obsessed with Friends, where they talked about the friends like they were their friends. Like they talked about them
Yeah.
like, I was just hanging out with this guy named Chandler who, wouldn't stop playing foosball. And, maybe I should get into foosball. I could do that for a while. Like it's so many of these relationships that feel in your heart
Hmm.
like they're real. And to
Right.
have all these other things getting in the way of that is so strained. And I guess maybe that's another reason I'm lured to Bob's Burgers, because it's
Mm.
like the animation aspect of it makes it feel even more like another reality that I can just submerge myself into, like something further removed from everything
Yeah.
going on here that I don't want to be thinking about when I'm just trying to watch TV and, relax and connect with these artists and their work. So
To me, all of these consumer capitalist commercial decisions that they're making, it's not a new problem. Like you're talking about
sure,
Friends and how
absolutely.
people were talking about, these are my friends. This is appointment television. At that time, they were also selling so much merchandise. Like it was a profitable show. And one of the things that I think is part of the reason so many shows aren't given chances to get longer lives, and this is where I'm going to sound real crazy, is because consumer products divisions don't get involved until minimum season 2. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, they need to feel like there's already a solid fan base there before they're going to service that fan base. But it's, as you mentioned a second ago, if that fan base doesn't know that show will be there, they don't tune in season 1. Sometimes they wait to make sure it's coming back for season 2. So it kind of just is this cycle of nobody's helping anybody keep the show on the air or keep the show streaming. And it drives me nuts because, not to derail my own podcast topic, but one of my favorite things growing up was the Warner Brothers stores that they used to have
Oh yeah.
because
Yeah,
of
yeah.
all the Friends merchandise. And I
Yep.
didn't even ask you, but like, did you have a lot of Friends merchandise? Do you have a lot of Bob's Burgers merchandise? What is your level of commitment here?
Boy, that's a great question. I think I had more Friends merchandise when I was younger, and I think after so many moves, it's kind
Mm,
of dissipated. And with Bob's Burgers, Man, I remember I went to one of the Comic Cons to cover one of their panels where they handed out the Louise like bunny ears that kind of
Hmm.
just like slid onto your head, and those are around here somewhere. Um, but it's funny that you mentioned the WB stores because that was one of the first things I did when I got to LA. Like when I moved to LA 13, 14 years ago,
Hmm.
um, I realized that those were just there, that you could just go to them and like
Hmm.
walk inside. Like you didn't have to pay for the tour,
Right.
which
It
I
wasn't.
did at some point, but like
Wait,
it
are
wasn't
you talking about the stores
requisite.
on the Warner Brothers lot?
There's the one that was like, yeah, just
Oh,
outside of
no,
the
no, no.
lot.
I'm
And
talking
then
about
there
the
were others
commercial
that were
stores.
the
So I don't know. I don't, where you grew up, maybe you didn't have this, but
I had
like
no
the Disney
stores.
store, they would put them in malls. Like they would put the Disney store in malls. They would put
Oh
flagship
my God.
WB stores. There was one on 57th and, oh no, Fifth in Manhattan, because my mom's office
Oh
building was
my
literally right
God.
across the street. She worked at 9 West, which, P.S., the building is Chandler's work building. When they show his exterior, that was my mom's building, and I was so excited about it.
That's
But
pretty dope.
there was a Warner Brothers store on the corner, and they, for the longest time, had, the giant six faces in the window of them. And so every level would be different, and it was built to service
Oh,
adults and kids. So there was like a DC, a Batman DC section. There were Tweety Bird, Sylvester, Looney Tune sections, and then when Friends became popular, there was tons of Friends shirts, mugs, everything. They would, if they could, mouse pads, if they could slap the logo and their faces on it, they would, and they would sell it. And there was like a candy section. It was amazing. I loved it. But the reason I'm saying this is because that's not something we have anymore. If you're a fan of
yeah,
TV, if you're a fan of these shows, most of the merch you're getting is, I don't want to use the word bootleg, fan driven, I would argue, like
right.
unauthorized.
You're going to Etsy. Like that's where you're going to find kind of the best stuff. And I do find it baffling as much as, we've looked into it and kind of understand the forces that go into the
Sure.
decisions to make those products and or not. But I distinctly remember, and like again, I grew up in rural Illinois, and there was a mall near the movie theater I went to, but it didn't have anything like what you're talking about. I'm trying to remember where I first went into a Warner Brothers store because it was before I went to LA, but it must have been in Chicago.
Mm.
Um, but I remember the feeling of going in and thinking like anything that Warner Brothers did should be here. So like I was
Hmm.
so excited to see Friends and see all the Friends stuff, but then I would also, I'd look around for, the different movies that they released or other TV shows that weren't as popular that I still knew about and loved, and it blew your mind that they didn't have it. Like
That's true.
it like especially now when you go into the store, you're just like, wait, where is this
Hmm.
and where is that and why isn't there just like a section dedicated? And it's it makes sense the way that brick and mortar stores are going these days, but that feeling is important
Yeah.
to be able to hook the audience like in a way where they're invested outside of just the TV show itself and they want to create that atmosphere and those memories like permanently.
Yeah.
So yeah, I I definitely could have more Friends merch.
No, I'm
I
not, I'm not,
don't think I'd
I
ever
wasn't
turn it
trying to
away.
like shame you. The sad thing is that I was going to put my friend's pillow on the chairs behind me for anyone watching at YouTube, and I just forgot. So I was like, I have some friends merch, but it's not visible now. But
I'm staring at my leftovers merch, which is like a Patty Funko doll, and then I've got two Veep things in here, which is like a poster and a little Selena Meyer.
nice.
Um, but yeah,
Funko.
I'm trying to remember the rest of my friends. I wonder where
Well,
it is.
I did want to, since you mentioned, obviously it's a big thing that fans could have, but don't have a lot of authorized stuff. I mean, I feel like a lot of what today what people are getting hooked by is just like the ability to rewatch so much and the ability to have the access to when streamers decide to keep the content on the site or to license it to a different streamer, like the ability to go back and see older stuff or newer stuff, just stuff that they've loved. Is there, you mentioned rewatching earlier, is there an episode of Bob's Burgers that you feel like you rewatch the most, that it just is either something when you need to like go to your happy place or just for whatever reason?
I'm not going to remember the name of it because
Okay.
they all are named with like such terrific puns. I love puns is probably another qualifier I should put in there for why Bob's Burgers likely sticks with me. But the episode when Bob goes to pick out the turkey and starts talking to the turkey that he's making on Thanksgiving, whenever
Mhm.
Bob does voices for the food that he's cooking, there's something so peculiar about it and yet so endearing. It's like he's so excited by the process of cooking these foods, and yet like with a turkey, that was a living breathing creature at some point and now it's dead and he's still animating it like with his voice and
Mhm.
whatever ideas pop into his head. Every time that happens, I love it. But the episode where he actually like goes to the
Mhm.
butcher and has to pick out the turkey and go through all these motions, and he's kind of in public with like a little bit of private embarrassment going
Yeah.
on. I adore those episodes, and it's something that I really respect about the show because they've brought it back from time to time, but it's something that I think in lesser hands they would have over relied upon to the
Mm.
point where it just got ruined, where it was like they're calling back to the callbacks to the callbacks. And this is, instead of creating new ideas,
Right.
they just settled into their groove of what worked and give the fans quote unquote what they want. And I don't think they did that. I feel like Lauren and the team really kept pushing forward in ways that brought out new exciting things. And that's how we got the Miyazaki tribute episode and so many of these like kind of pop culture spin-off episodes.
Mm.
I feel like it started with a basic idea of like, what if Bob was
Right.
so attached to these things that we could build the world out from there? And it really works. So I don't know what the psychological element of it is
That's
beyond that.
okay.
Like I don't know if there's a weird formative part of my past that
Yeah,
likes people
can
who speak for food, but
can I mention something I observed?
sure.
The first thing you pointed out with Bob's Burgers was a Thanksgiving episode, and Friends is so known for
That's
its
true.
Thanksgiving episodes, and Chandler
That's
was so
true.
traumatized by Thanksgiving that it feels like it's Thanksgiving is the connective tissue for you.
It's interesting too because I do love Thanksgiving. I think I actively repress that Chandler didn't like
Really?
Thanksgiving. Like obviously I know like when as soon as you said it, I was like, yes.
I don't
But
even
I
know what to
think
say.
because I think it just bucks up against my natural inclination to love Thanksgiving that he
Mm,
doesn't, because he's also, like you said, so associated with one of the best parts of Thanksgiving, which are the Friends Thanksgiving episodes. Like,
yeah.
it's like, how could he not like the thing that he's responsible for creating that I love? Like
Mm,
that doesn't compute. I reject this. So then I just kind of set that aside.
okay.
Even though, yeah, it makes it better. Like his reluctance to take part in Thanksgiving absolutely makes it more special. So
I think so.
yeah.
All right. Well, listen, you've given us a lot of stuff to go rewatch and to think about. Before we say goodbye, I want to say to everybody who's watching, if you want to go check out the shows that Ben and I have talked about today, I'm going to tell you where you can find them as of today when we're taping this episode, because as we've mentioned, sometimes things go away on streamers. So, if you're watching this a long time from now, don't reply me that it's not where I said it was. I also need to specify that Made Possible by Pop Culture is not sponsored by or getting any perks from these services for me mentioning them. I'm just sharing this information so that you guys can watch the shows and learn to love them the way that we have. Friends is streaming on Max. New Girl, which we mentioned briefly, is on Peacock and Hulu. Bob's Burgers is streaming on Hulu. And I'm going to throw in a mention for It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia on Hulu because we touched on it so briefly, but I really do like it too. So
Oh, I love
maybe
it.
that'll
I
be a
love it.
future episode. We'll see.
Sunny is definitely one that I would be wary to analyze why it connects so strongly with me because of how dark that show can get,
Yeah.
especially my favorite character, Dennis Reynolds.
I was gonna say the
Um,
last season finale, that was just me in a nutshell. His like rage spiral. I was like,
that's so
oh,
good.
they were in my head.
That
But
was
that's
also
just,
a
I do think
yeah.
that's a whole other episode, which maybe we'll get to. But I don't know for now. Thank you, Ben, for coming on and taking time out of your very busy review schedule.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope that anything I've said has made the shows either more appealing or more interesting to revisit on your own. It's something that as a critic is always top priority. It's just having the conversation about TV and TV that you think is worthy of talking about. Like that's the gig in a nutshell for me. And the fact that you did this and made this possible is very kind of you. So thank you for
Oh,
having me.
cool. Well, thank you. Well, if everybody is listening at home, if you like this podcast, please like, comment, and subscribe. Also, you can follow it on social media. There will be fun clips promoting the upcoming episodes as the season goes on. So thanks, everybody.